Welcome to Supply Circles, stories from the innovators, disruptors and improvers in supply chain management today. Brought to you by AI Group.
Welcome, if this is your first time, to Supply Circles. I'm James Scotland, coming to you today from Surface Paradise in the Yunganbar language region. And this is the business improvement podcast that asks the question, how can we in Australia create supply chains that are resilient and sustainable at a time when we're implementing the 3 Ds, digitalisation, decarbonisation, and the diversification of our risk profiles, especially in extended supply chains. Each fortnight, I delve into different sections of the end-to-end supply chain. I chat with fascinating and interesting people, and we try to have some fun along the way. Now, here's the thing. Well, up until the 1970s or so, businesses did everything they could in-house. As much as possible, businesses handled all aspects of production and distribution within their 4 walls. Businesses had engineers, mechanics, fitters and turners, design people, time and motion experts, procurement staff, big warehouses holding everything conceivable, fleet managers, travel arrangers, sales planners, and so much more. They even had employees staffing the canteens and a much-loved tea lady who brought tea and biscuits to office staff, sort of an early version of today's flight attendants. And all this was managed and coordinated and planned by general managers. Over time, everything not regarded as the core function of the business has been outsourced. And the general managers of today are now supply chain managers or business improvement managers or COOs, looking to gain maximum effectiveness from the complex and dynamic labyrinth of relationships that we call business today. This podcast addresses that question. How do we make all of this work in a way that makes our business sustainable and resilient despite the constant disruptions and changes and the many complex relationships? And speaking of complex, one of the most complex, challenging, structured and potentially rewarding supply chains in Australia is the defence industry here and with our allies. It's big, really big, over $50 billion per year in Australia alone. And forward estimates have $223.6 billion put aside for defence industry. It's a sector worth considering for your business. But again, here's the thing. Defence industry is regarded as a structured, sometimes called mature supply chain, because the rules of entry and operations for all levels of the chain are clearly defined. Each level of the supply chain is different from the others, and it's all well known, strongly documented, and very specific. Yet it also needs to keep changing and adapting to new threats and new strategic postures and new technology. It's a complex and structured and defined and bureaucratic, yet constantly changing system, and all of it is within the high-stakes, dangerous and demanding environment of national defence. The governments here and around the world have made some important announcements regarding changes recently. So what does all this mean for business? In fact, what does it all mean? Let's get an update from a great friend of the show and well-known defence industry operator and commentator, Sarah Pavillard, the founder and CEO of Adroita. Now, if you want to know more about the irrepressible Sarah, have a listen to episode 19, where Sarah tells us her backstory and we discuss the concept of Australia as a nation, as a supplier to the defence industry, a sort of whole-of-country approach. It's a good episode. We'll put the links in the show notes. But today, Sarah is here to tell us about the recent review and new positioning of the Australian Navy and the release of the Defence Industry Development Strategy, the DIDS, by Australian Minister of Defence Industry, Pat Conroy. Perhaps she'll be able to make it all clearer for us, provide some clarity to the chaos and the confusion. She'll certainly provide some great insights. She always does. I'm always excited to talk to Sarah. Hello, Sarah. Welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me with you today, James. I'm really excited about this conversation because it's about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, surface fleet capabilities in the Royal Australian Navy.
Well, tell us about the recent announcements. What's been going on?
Well, there's been a lot going on for those in the know within the sector. Many of you will be aware that there have been some really significant changes afoot since really the announcement of AUKUS. So I might frame it from that point onwards because these elements are all interconnected and interdependent, and it's very difficult to understand the meaningfulness of this enhanced lethality surface combatant fleet review outcomes without understanding how we got here. So firstly, back in 2021, we had the big top-line announcements regarding the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine program, and also investments in critical capabilities between Australia, the US, and the UK, a step change in trilateral security arrangements for all three countries. That was closely followed by an election here in Australia and a change of government. And one of the key election promises of Labor was to undertake a review of our national defence strategy. So the Defence Strategic Review was tabled around this time last year, and it laid out an updated, refreshed series of defence objectives and 6 high priorities, but it also identified that more work needed to be done to understand what the most appropriate composition of the surface combatant fleet, and I'll come back to what surface combatants are, in order to deliver on the needs for the surface fleet review. So that requirement was for an independent analysis of Navy's surface combatant fleet capability to be conducted by the end of Q3 in 2023, so by the end of September last year, to ensure the size, structure and composition of the surface combatant fleet complement the capabilities of the forthcoming conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines. So that's really important. We can't understand the context of this surface combatant review without understanding that it's deeply interconnected with our future nuclear-powered submarine capabilities.
There was announcements that said we're going to get some whole bunch of new submarines, and then from that they did a review that said, well, if we're getting new submarines, we better see what's on the surface to support those submarines. And now we've got a report that says how we link the new surface fleet to the underwater fleet. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and to understand, well, given that we're now buying these nuclear-powered submarines, what needs to change about how we operate the surface fleet and what kind of capability it brings to the table? And then the other interlinked election promise was that government identified that it would review defence industry policy. And just over 2 weeks ago, shortly, hot on the heels of the outcomes of the Surface Fleet Review, we've also had the announcement of the new Defence Industrial Development Strategy, which you mentioned at the opening of the podcast, James.
So that must be all really good then. Everything's fine. Everything's working well. We've got a new approach to underwater defence, a new approach to above water defence. We've got a new approach to how industry is going to support that. Wonderful brand new world, Sarah. There's also in the Defence Strategic Review, you've got to have an acronym, DSR, they discussed the fact that the whole of the Australian defence would move away from dumb World War II concept armaments or throwing steel into the air and hoping what happens to a smart way of doing it called GUIA, guided weapons and explosive ordnance. Is that all part of this whole picture as well?
Well, absolutely. So amongst the top 6 priorities that were drawn out of the Defence Strategic Review were the fastest possible acquisition of nuclear-powered submarine capabilities, including the ability to build them in Australia, the fast-tracking more guided weapons, including the ability to manufacture our own guided weapons here in Australia, and to acquire more strike capability in order to hold Australia's adversaries further afield from our sovereign interests. There is a requirement to strengthen the northern regions, so bases and defence infrastructure in northern Australia, and also to accelerate game-changing technologies into the hands of warfighters faster. There's a priority regarding workforce because of, I think actually a national workforce crisis really when it comes to STEM capabilities is also having very substantive impact on the defence sector. And then there's a priority to really step up engagement with our allies and increase our engagement in the Pacific region. So all of these elements are actually linked into the decision making and the considerations that would have been undertaken by the three leads on the Enhanced Lethality Surface Combatant Fleet Review and what they recommended to government, and then informed government's decisions in what they would take forward from that review.
There were some surprises in the lethality review, wasn't there? Because we're changing ships, and we're going to stop building some and build some others. Is that correct?
I think for some in the sector there were some surprises, but I think if we look more broadly, if we get on the balcony and consider that our strategic review identified that sovereign shipbuilding would remain a very high priority for defence investment, there were long-term rumours that there are challenges with the build and construction of the Hunter-class frigate, and questions were being asked about whether or not it had enough teeth, so enough missile cells to carry the level of or the number of missiles to be effective in a future conflict scenario, holding fast that it has the current design has very potent anti-submarine warfare capabilities. There have been some announcements that Australia will retire its Anzac-class frigates in line with their planned withdrawal dates rather than extending their life of type. So this is one area, one of the few recommendations actually that government didn't take forward from the reviewers. So the reviewers recommended a life of type extension, or that we get on with what was called the TRANSCAP, the Transition Capability Assurance Program for the Anzac class. Instead, government has made the decision that HMS Anzac and Arunta will be retired at their planned withdrawal dates, and that the life of the other vessels won't be extended. I think that decision has been in part to enable freeing up of funding to allow for rapid acquisition of what's been called the general purpose frigate. So this is what's considered to be a tier 2 vessel, bit less teeth, but maybe a broader set of roles for constabulary, humanitarian and disaster relief and other functions. And the intent for the acquisition of these general purpose frigates is to acquire 3 off-the-shelf to an existing design from a foreign shipyard as fast as possible, with the first to be in service by 2030. That's an extremely ambitious timeframe. But the decision to, or for which platform will be acquired, will be made within 12 months, and that the remaining 8 will be constructed in Western Australia in a shipyard yet to be designed and developed. So that's just on those large surface vessels or surface combatant vessels. In addition, the Hobart-class destroyers that are currently in service will be accelerated through a major modification program to enhance their weapon systems, some of which have already been announced, such as the Tomahawk land attack missile upgrade. And then there have been some additional announcements about cancelling the construction of 6 offshore patrol vessels of a Lursen design. They're currently being built in Western Australia. That program will continue to run for 5 more years, but it is a significant change. However, government has committed to building additional Evolve Cape class patrol vessels, a large optimally crewed surface vessel capability, so essentially a missile barge type capability to complement those large surface combatants.
A missile barge.
It's a very, but what is an LOSV? We're so full of acronyms in our sector. What does that mean to someone who doesn't operate in our sector? But the reality is we have this real challenge of getting more weapons to the warfighter, more missiles to the warfighter, and changing the current design of the current platforms in service or the ones that are about to commence construction is very, very challenging. So then I think that the reviewers are asking the question, how do we unlock the potential of future autonomy and start changing concepts of operations and design processes and build processes here in Australia? And then how do we get more of this pointy, sharp warfighting technology to the warfighter without increasing crewing and workforce demand? So there's some really complex trade-offs that the reviewers and government have had to make. And in terms of those trade-offs, some of the decisions that will need to be made will include things like design and the arrangements for infrastructure in Henderson. We already know from the strategic review that a major consolidation has been flagged. Austal has been identified as a sovereign shipbuilding partner in Western Australia and is going to have a very, very full dance card. It's going to be very, very challenging for industry to step up to deliver. As a ex-Navy person and a weapons engineer, I'm very excited about the huge step up that's on offer to Navy in terms of its surface combatant capabilities.
Yeah, just to put this into context, this is a great summary. Thank you, Sarah. But to put it into context, we live in an island, and the only way you can protect an island is with a Navy fleet, with a fleet. There's, you need an Air Force and you need an Army for sure. But the Navy is critical to an island's defence. We are talking now about making sure that we have a shipbuilding capability within Australia, plus a sustainment and a maintenance capability for a wide range of vessels. So this is a big industry we're talking about building. For years, people have said, what happened to the car industry? And it's almost like, screw the car industry. Look at how big this thing is.
I think it's very exciting. And as I said right at the start of this discussion, both the Defence Strategic Review and the Enhanced Lethality Surface Combatant Fleet Independent Analysis, which is such a mouthful. So I'm going to call it the Surface Combatant Fleet Review going forward.
That's still a mouthful.
It really is. But needless to say, this review reaffirmed Defence's commitment and the nation's commitment to building a naval shipbuilding industry, not just a shipbuilding industry, but a naval shipbuilding industry, which probably has layers of complexity in addition to what would ordinarily be required for design, development and build of commercial vessels. And this step up needs to happen concurrent with government and Navy delivering a nuclear-powered submarine build industry here in Australia as well. And many of the skills and capabilities and workforce will be in demand, not just across the shipbuilding sector, but as you said, James, the maintenance, so maintenance and sustainment as an element of that. But more broadly, they're very analogous to the skills that are in demand in the tech sector, in other heavy engineering and construction, infrastructure, mining, and across Australia, we're really confronted with a significant workforce shortage when it comes to STEM skills.
Well, I want to dive deeper into that because I know you've got a unique perspective on that. Before we get there, let's just go back to the AUKUS agreement, to this idea that we're going to be involved in nuclear-powered submarines. I see a report has come out saying a Los Angeles-class so-called fast attack US submarine called the USS Annapolis, of course, arrived in HMAS Sterling in Western Australia. According to reports, the nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarine, its visit to HMAS Sterling is the second visit by a fast attack submarine since the announcement of the AUKUS Optimum Pathway in March 2023. So we've had two visits in quite a short time, and they're seeming to be ramping up. Is that what you're hearing, that the AUKUS is moving forward? The reason I ask this is because I'm really keen to understand what it means for business in regards to AUKUS.
Absolutely.
I know some people are running hard on the possibilities. while many others are more cautious and saying it's going to take a long time, settle down, we need to get set up.
So AUKUS is absolutely moving forward. And whilst, with any huge mission-led nation-building agenda, and in this case, it's actually a trilateral US, UK, Australia, 3 nation-building agenda, does take time. My understanding is that all 3 governments are all in when it comes to AUKUS. And there's a few things that are really important to consider in the context. So one of the first elements of the optimal pathway for nuclear-powered submarines is building Australia's nuclear-powered sub-stewardship capabilities to be able to manage technical risk, manage compliance, and ensure safety. But another key critical step is the establishment by 2027 of the Submarine Rotational Force West. So a squadron of Virginia-class submarines, 4 Virginia-class submarines, and 1 British Astute-class submarine will be forward operating from HMS Sterling in Western Australia. This is a very significant step change. In order to enable that...
That's big, isn't it? That's big.
I think that it hasn't been properly contextualised to Australians just how big this is. This is going to be will be the US's only forward operating position in the Indian Ocean for their Virginias. And it will be the only maintenance facility in the Southern Hemisphere, as I understand it. I could be slightly off there, but fundamentally, this is critical not just to Australia. I'm going to the US in a couple of weeks, and I'm really looking forward to actually feeling the vibe on the ground in terms of where Americans sit. And although there has been some discussion around deferral of one of the Virginia-class builds and, the need to rapidly scale up the industrial base, not just in the US, but also in Australia and the UK, the fact is that every official that I speak to is reinforcing, whether British, American or Australian, we are all in on AUKUS.
And I think that point about trying to get our heads around it, someone explained it to me that if you're talking about a sustainment and a maintenance base of the most highly advanced submarines in the world, ever in the history of the world, that base alone, let alone the skills involved and the people that are there, that base alone will be the most technically advanced piece of real estate on the face of the earth. These submarines, US, UK and Australia, will be protecting 2 of the largest oceans we have. And keeping them safe and keeping them sustained will take massive technology.
Absolutely. So I just want to touch in on that technical advancement in terms of the base and the infrastructure. So currently, the Osborne Naval Shipyard, which is building the Hunter-class frigates and will facilitate the upgrade of the destroyers, the Osborne Naval Shipyard in South Australia, the one that is there now, is commencing construction this year of the Hunter-class frigate, is one of the most advanced naval shipyards in the world. In addition to that, major infrastructure investments, $3 billion has been invested in Australian naval infrastructure or thereabouts to step up the infrastructure at the submarine build shipyard to prepare for building the AUKUS submarine design from the 2030s onwards for delivery around 2040. On top of that, we've now had the strategic review recommend major transformation and consolidation at the Henderson's shipyard in Western Australia. And so that's to fence the yard and the facilities there to step up the security so that Virginia-class and other nuclear-powered submarines can be maintained in Western Australia going forward. And then there's additional investments will be necessary to create a steel hull shipyard that can build and deliver the general purpose frigate that was an announcement from the Enhanced Lethality fleet review, Surface Combatant fleet review. So not only are we investing in the actual design, build, maintenance, sustainment, and the support system of the systems, the platforms, the ships themselves, but Australia is making huge investments in the infrastructure so that we can do this not just for the next 20 years, but for the next 100 years as a true maritime and middle power within the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah. So listeners are no doubt saying, "Whoa, this is huge, Sarah. This is staggering. How are we going to do that?" And the answer, of course, has been partially addressed in the DIDS, the Defence Industry Development Strategy. DIDS. I just get used to the acronyms like you. Our CEO, Ines Willock, said, whilst being overly strongly supportive of the strategy, he noted that there needs to be a sort of more agreed approach to industry strategy. He said, quote, "In recent times, there's been a concern in relation to the lack of progress of defence capability projects and the lack of visibility of future capability requirements. The Australian Industry Group continues to advocate that the DID should recognise that Australian industry is a fundamental part of the national defence strategy." In other words, he's saying that we need a whole-of-nation approach for this very small island to this massive project. I gather from what you're saying, you agree.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, actually. And in fact, I think that there are some strengths with DIDS, but I also think that there are some really serious shortcomings. And the first of those shortcomings that I think it's really important to point out is the definition around sovereign industry. So whilst previously within the defence sector, sovereign capability or sovereign industry had a more specific definition around Australian control and ownership, the DIDS has really diluted that. So sovereign defence industry is being defined as, having an ABN and the ability to provide products to defence. And as some very eminent strategists pointed out, Marcus Hellier and Michael Shoebridge, they've pointed out that, that means that some of our adversaries' technology and capabilities fall within that very broad definition. And why that's important is because it directly impacts the investments and funding and the requirements on defence to make investments in Australian technology, Australian intellectual capital, Australian businesses. One of the challenges that the sector has faced since the change of government is a feeling of death by 1,000 reviews. So I'm not questioning the necessity of resetting our defence priorities, getting to a national defence strategy, getting the right integrated investment plan. But that has come with changes and very significant cancellations to projects, a very substantive allocation of funding to be injected into the US defence industry base in order to scale up the capability to produce Virginia-class submarines in the US. And the consequence is that less money has been spent with Australian industry, in particular Australian SMEs, over the last 18 months. Industry, and I'm sure that your listeners who are business owners or working within businesses will fundamentally know that, a business is not like a tap. You can't turn off the flow of funding or purchase orders or revenue and hold it for 12, 18, 24 months and turn it on and expect the same resourcing and capability to come out of the tap. The risk that we have at the moment is that we are in this valley in terms of investments into local industry, and it's creating a tension in terms of the long-term need to scale up for this extraordinary and exciting nation-building agenda, but the ability for Australian businesses to participate today and to survive until such time as the funding and the policy settings are in place. Does that make sense, James?
I'm sure that every listener is saying, I'm hearing you, sister, because that's exactly what I'm hearing as the GM of the Defence Supply Network for AI Group. They're saying, it's just, we need to know what's going on. In fact, I'll quote Ines because I agree with this, and I know that you have some thoughts on this. I'll just find the quote. He says, whilst there are a range of initiatives noted in the DIDs to grow the tier two sector, that's SMEs, there appears to be a lack of teeth to enable this strategy to be a success. We also seek to understand how the DIDs will complement the broader national programs, including the National Reconstruction Fund. So, paraphrasing him, I think he's saying, there's so many things going on in Australia. We have this massive project in defence, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff. How are we going to make it all happen? And what guidance are you giving us in terms of an industry policy?
Look, and I think he's absolutely right to ask that question. I think DIDS is actually a bit like being half pregnant. We're part of the way there, but we actually don't have the roadmap that industry has been waiting for. So there are definitely some green shoots, and certainly from a shipbuilding perspective, again, including the build of submarines, it's reaffirmed government's commitment to that. I think there's a lack of consistency in how the different sovereign defence industry priorities have been laid out. So there's a number of priorities. And I think one of the big challenges is potentially actually stovepiping of industry policy within the department. So we've now got the submarine agency with an industry team. We've got the guided weapons and explosive enterprise organisation with its industry team. CASG, Capability Acquisition Sustainment Group, has its industry team, as does Naval Shipbuilding and Sustainment Group. And whilst the intent is to harmonise them and bring them together, it is potentially diluting the impact of some of the individual policies. I think the other point that's really important to make here, James, is that there's also a focus on supporting Australian businesses to enter the global supply chain. My personal view is that in some ways here in Australia, we actually have a department potentially in terms of defence that might not fully believe in the capabilities of Australian industry. So, and combating ideology can be quite challenging. And what I mean by that is, if you don't believe that the Australian industrial base has the capability to step up and deliver some or part of these technologies and these very complex platforms, then the whole premise of the industry policy is going to be that it can't be done here. So how do we get this capability as quickly as possible through alternate means? And I think that message is actually coming through quite strongly in DIDS, because there is a focus on how to get Australian businesses into global supply chains, as opposed to how do we invest in Australian businesses to scale up and step up in the defence sector here in Australia. And I think that that belief gap is something that's very, very challenging to address. And even with great data and great examples, it remains a persistent issue. And it really does impact the decision-making around what the industry policy settings are. The second thing on that, when it comes to this global supply chain perspective, is given that is how government is structuring industry policy, and the ambition of AUKUS is calling on enhancing the Australian, the US, and the American defence sector industrial base, but particularly nuclear-powered submarines and these advanced capabilities, we need to work out how do we bring a national effort to the table, and then how do we take that national effort and integrate it into the US and the American ecosystems. Without doing that, I think it's going to be quite challenging for Australian businesses to succeed in the market. And there is an urgent need to build the capability, particularly in the US, to allow these submarines to be delivered to Australia. And I think in the longer term to enable the types of surface combatant capabilities that we were talking about earlier to be delivered as well, given their interdependence with the American weapon systems that are in use on the platforms.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point. What we're talking about is creating sovereign capability using the national capabilities that we already have, which are much stronger than many people believe, but then integrating that sovereign capability with our allies. I think defence talk about never alone, never again, something along that sort of catch line, that we are an allies.
It does, but James, what I would say is that we have an industry policy in front of us that is telling us that if you're a foreign-owned and controlled prime, and there's absolutely a need for our prime contractors in the defence ecosystem, those tier one, very complex designers, builders. But if we're seeing that they are sovereign industrial capability and then they have control of the supply chain as the supply chain integrator, it completely changes how defence thinks about investing in SMEs. It sort of outsources the thinking about that to the primes. Now, if we are in a crisis, and keep in mind that the Defence Strategic Review tells us, and government agrees, we are in the most urgent of strategic circumstances, we may not be able to rely on foreign-controlled primes to act in Australia's interest. And the reason I say that is if we're in a crisis and our partners, as deep as our friendship and commitment to one another is, they are going to prioritise their own defence needs first. So whether it's a board controlled out of London or a board controlled out of DC, they'll act in American or British interest first. And I think we have to keep that in mind about thinking about sovereign capability. So whilst the Defence Industry Development Strategy dilutes that definition, I think it's really in Australian SMEs' interests, and I think in the interest of many of your AI group or of AI group members to really advocate for recognition of the special place that Australian-owned, operated, controlled companies, whether it's, our ASX-listed companies like Austal or Downer Group, or whether it's Australian small to medium enterprises, they need the investment and support to enable them to scale up to meet the future needs here in Australia.
I said that you would provide great insight, and there you go. We shouldn't take a break. I always think of, just because I'm silly, I always think of AUKUS as being a Australian Prime Minister and a British Prime Minister and an American President walk into a bar or walk onto a barge and take it from there. It's a big deal. You're going to America before we go to the break. You're going to America. What are you doing there?
Well, very excited. This is Adroita's third visit to the US. So last year, about this time actually, we attended our first US trade show and launched a white paper about micro partnerships in the age of AUKUS. So really thinking through business-to-business partnering in the AUKUS context and how businesses can get ahead of the curve, given that creating the legislation and the policy across Australia, the US and the UK to enable AUKUS takes a long time. It's a very complex policy and legislation that needs to be developed. So when we're in the US for this visit, we will be cementing existing partnerships, continuing to deliver some services that are already in motion, building new partnerships, and also just getting our ear to the ground to understand, as I said earlier, what's the vibe in the US. I'm hoping to have the opportunity to visit some shipyards, and I'll also be providing some briefings to government officials as well as private industry about AUKUS and the Australian context and what it might be like to partner with Australian businesses so that we can collectively make AUKUS happen as an industry sector.
Sounds exciting. We'll have to have you back on so we can hear what happens. All right, let's go to a break. And when we come back, I want to talk about STEMs.
If you have supply chain or business improvement challenges, contact AI Group's Business Improvement and Growth Hub. The Big Hub is a library of practical and relevant resources designed to assist member businesses to grow and improve. The Big Hub also includes an extensive network of experienced, pre-qualified business improvement consultants. For more details, contact big@aigroup.com.au. That's big@aigroup.com.au.
Sarah, before the break, you mentioned the idea of our workforce and the skills that we have. Now, there's a shortage of workers and there's a shortage of skills everywhere. But in defence, it's going to be even more challenging as we go from dumb to smart audience and from our current fleet and land force and air force to very advanced. And we're going to build a lot of it here. Tell me about the STEMs issue. And what's STEMs, by the way?
Okay, so for those who aren't aware, science, technology, engineering and maths skills are really critical to, all aspects of the technology life cycle within the defence sector, but across Australian industry more broadly. For Australia, we are experiencing a crisis in STEM skills. That's partly a result of insufficient numbers of Australian students choosing after they finish school to enter STEM careers, whether they're vocationally led or via higher education, university, postgraduate qualifications. And in the defence sector, this is exacerbated because not only are there additional barriers to working in the sector like security clearances and citizenship considerations, but as the AUKUS legislation is implemented, with the new trade controls requirements, there's going to be a narrowing definition around citizenship potentially that will impact the number of people who can work in certain parts of the industry. So we'll have not just the Australian citizenship requirements, there'll be limitations on dual citizenships. There will also be requirements to meet, or for Australians to be compliant with the export controls laws in the US. So Australia is currently in the process of working through legislation to provide the US confidence that we can manage this very sensitive technology that has really not been shared with any other nations prior. And we're applying blanket policy here. So it's not just in respect with nuclear-powered submarines, but one of the great potential benefits of AUKUS is this export license-free trade environment between Australia, the US and the UK, where it previously didn't exist. In terms of the STEM workforce more broadly, the Tech Council of Australia, maybe 18 months ago, shared some data that from 2023 to 2030, we have here in Australia a 640,000 person shortfall in terms of the necessary STEM and tech workers. Now, defence is just a small subset of that. But like I said, not only do we need those core skills and the citizenship, but there are other limits to the number of the total available workforce that can be accessed. We are really lamenting a workforce problem in the defence sector. And I sometimes think that we're actually asking ourselves the wrong question, because the question that I typically hear folks talking about is, how do we solve the workforce problem? They're not asking themselves a question, are we thinking about the workforce in the right way? So in light of the constraints and limitations, what are the questions we're not asking ourselves about?
You mean that we're not asking whether or not there's enough people in STEMs or what the future solution?
No, what I mean is I think that we're assuming that the workforce structure is always going to be what the workforce structure is. So, for example, in a International Women's Day event, I had the pleasure of sharing a panel with some really interesting panelists. And part of the conversation was about unlocking potential workforce in the defence sector. And the biggest underrepresented sector is women. And so women are not only underrepresented in STEM, but as a proportion of the total workforce, they're very underrepresented in the defence sector. So the question I think about is, how do we ensure that there's the fullest possible participation of more than 50% of the population in these in STEM more broadly, and in defence STEM capabilities more specifically? And I think that if we can't solve for that challenge, get maybe workforce participation up from 20% to 25, 30%. It offers us the fastest way to unlock the necessary workforce levels if we think about how to get the right engagement and the right education. And if we can't solve for women participating in the sector, I think we'll be at a real loss as to how we solve for other areas where more diversity is required, whether it's cultural diversity, Indigenous representation, other gender diversity, etc.
Wow, another big issue. So we've got a number of things on our plate. We've got the building of a massive sovereign capability, and we only talked about Navy today. We talked about a new defence industry strategy, which is good but has some holes. And then there is still, which everyone listening will know, there's still the skills and staff shortage with the point you're raising, I think, is great, that if we're going to talk about skills and staff shortage, we'll consider the fact that defence are going to gobble up a lot. If they can, defence industry will gobble up a lot if they can get them. It's going to be some interesting times ahead. We should go. Before we go, I just want to ask you about what all this means for business. In the Sovereign Defence Industry Priorities, which are part of the DIDs, there were 7 acronyms, 7 DIPs, SDIPs?
Yes, DIPs.
Sovereign Defence Industry Priorities. Repair, maintenance and sustainment of aircraft was one, ships another one, land systems, Army, GUIO, autonomous systems and battle management systems. I think there's a couple others, space and whatever. What does this mean for business? Everything you've said, plus the fact that there are these defence industry priorities, what should business people listening to this take away from our discussion?
Okay, so I think there's a couple of things that business people should be taking away. The first is that after, I think, what could be termed a dry spell in terms of investment in Australian industry, as government sort of undertaking restructuring of the whole premise of our national strategy and then all the subordinate plans and policies, investment is likely to increase. And we've actually already seen the first of that in terms of the commitment to the surface combatants. So over the next 10 years, over $11 billion of additional funding is being kicked in to enable that program to be delivered. And in the forward estimates over the next 4 years, there's an extra $1.7 billion on the table. So the spending is slowly ramping up. And ships and shipbuilding, inclusive of submarines, is an absolute priority. So if you're considering the defence sector, one of the things I would say is, if the maritime domain is not in your sights, it's time to get with the program. Even Army is making major investments in their what they're calling littoral, but ship and small boat capabilities. The second really key element is that support will be filtering into industry to enable Australian businesses to access global supply chains. So if I was thinking about the defence sector as a new or an emerging entrant, one of the key considerations I'd be looking at in terms of my strategy is, how do I progressively ready myself to operate in partnership with at least American and British businesses? And where can I start to grow my capability within their supply chains. The third thing that I'd be really thinking about is, how can I do this through partnership? So recognizing, one, that to achieve this, not just nation building agenda, but AUKUS trilateral 3-nation building agenda, takes a whole community. It doesn't happen as an individual company, or even an individual state. How can my business find the right partners to work together on these initiatives? How can I identify, new clients, but also new partners within my own supply chain? Where can we leverage or complement our collective capabilities rather than looking at how to make my own rice ball bigger? So I really think that here in Australia, we need to be thinking about, how do we bring the full potential of Australian industry to the table in the AUKUS context? And then the final thing that I'd be thinking about is, really, if I am serious about defence, or see that this could offer my business an opportunity for growth, it's very important to start getting on top of security. Even if actually you're not in the defence sector, you really need to start getting laser focused on security. The security risks are just increasing every day in terms of cyber security, cyber attack, hacking, digital theft. Everyone who knows a lot more about cybersecurity than I do tells me, no matter what you're doing, you're not doing enough. So start making the investments, because it's going to be a really important insurance policy. And then the final thing that I would say is, businesses like mine, Adroita, we're not the only ones, but find people who can help you shorten the path, find the path of least resistance into the defence sector, or for opening up that next revenue opportunity. We don't need to do this on our own, and we are stronger together, both in terms of a specific area of expertise, or operating together as Australian industry within this very complex global context.
Yeah, the Australian Industry Group Defence Supplier Network, which you guys are a great supporter of, and thank you so much, always says, I'm always saying, the very minimal outcome of learning how to be a defence supplier is you become a better business. You get better at security. You get better at all sorts of stuff, because it is such a demanding sector. We also say you can't do it on your own, and so you need to talk to networks like ours. You need to engage specialists like you. We'll put your contact details in the show notes so that people can contact Adroita, and I'll put Defence Supplier Network in there too, just in case you want to know what AI Group's doing. This has been a fabulous chat. Thank you so much. All the best in America. Let's. I hope you enjoy it. It's successful. And let's try and get you back on again at some stage, because this is evolving space by the sound of it.
Definitely. And thank you, James, to AI Group and Supply Circles for giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts about an area that has really been my part of SHIP for the last 25 years, which is surface combatants.
We can hear the passion, and thank you for sharing it. Well, that's it for another episode of Supply Circles. Thanks again for listening and for your feedback. When you hear this episode, Sarah will be in the US and I'll be on holidays in Vietnam. So we'll be sending our love to you all. If you have any feedback on today's interview or ideas for the show, or just want to give me some feedback, hit me up at james.scotland@aigroup.com.au. That's 1T. Or head over to my LinkedIn page. I'd love to hear from you. And we'll be back in a fortnight with more business improvement insights into the keys to building sustainable supply chains. Thank you for joining me. This is Supply Circles. I'm James Scotland. Bye for now.